The cold winds of Lyran 3 whispered, like mournful ghosts, across the jagged ridges of obsidian rock. Captain Eryk Halden stumbled to his knees, his suit's systems blaring warnings that grew more insistent by the second. His breathing was shallow, ragged, each inhale scraping against his lungs like fire. Blood trickled from a gash on his temple, matting his hair and staining the cracked visor of his helmet. The last thing he remembered before darkness claimed him was the distant roar of the dust storm rolling in, carrying with it the unforgiving weight of this hostile alien world. Eryk had been leading a reconnaissance team to map the terrain and establish a forward camp for the Alliance expedition. The mission had been standard until the ambush. Serite's predatory creatures native to Lyran 3, with jagged exoskeletons and a hive mind sharper than any artificial intelligence, descended from the cliffs in a coordinated swarm. The team fought valiantly, but it was a losing battle from the start. Eryk had ordered his crew to retreat, staying behind to buy them time. The Serites overran him in minutes. When the rescue ship failed to detect his life signs amidst the storm, the crew made the gut-wrenching decision to retreat. No one survives a direct encounter with the Serites' commander. Lila Farn had whispered, her voice heavy with guilt as they lifted off, leaving their captain behind. By all rights, Eryk Halden should have been dead. Lila sat in the command tent of Camp Delta, staring at the perimeter scanners. The camp was a hastily constructed grid of prefabricated modules and shield generators, offering a fragile sanctuary against the lethal environment of Lyran 3. Around her, the surviving members of the crew were subdued, each wrestling with their own grief. The captain was not just a leader to them, he was their friend, the glue that held their mismatched personalities together. "Any activity on the scanners?" asked Rafe, the team's engineer, as he entered, holding 2 steaming mugs of Kel root tea. "Just storms and rocks," Lila replied, accepting a mug. "Nothing living out there. Not for long, anyway." Well, Rafe hesitated. "You made the right call, you know. We couldn't risk the whole crew for." "For a dead man," Lila interrupted, her voice sharper than she intended. "That's what he is, Rafe. A dead man." The two sat in strained silence, listening to the distant howl of the wind. At the edge of the storm, Eryk stirred. Pain greeted him like an old, unwelcome friend. His suit's diagnostics were an incomprehensible mess of red and yellow alerts, but one thing was clear: his oxygen reserves were critically low. He groaned, forcing himself to sit up. The Serites had left him for dead, their hive instincts dismissing him as no longer a threat. Their venom, meant to paralyze and kill, had oddly only numbed his extremities and slowed his movements. Perhaps it was his human biochemistry, something they didn't fully understand. Whatever the reason, it was a sliver of luck he intended to exploit. Pulling himself to his feet, Eryk surveyed the terrain. The distant glimmer of Camp Delta's shield dome was barely visible through the dust-filled air. It wasn't far in linear distance, but the terrain between him and salvation was treacherous, riddled with jagged fissures and Serite hunting grounds. He stumbled forward, each step an act of sheer will. His training kicked in, overriding the screaming protests of his body. He scavenged what he could: a sharpened fragment of rock for a makeshift weapon, scraps of fabric from his torn suit to bind his wounds. He moved with a single-minded determination, his survival instincts honed from years of missions on hostile worlds. The first night was the hardest. The temperature plummeted, frost forming on his visor and joints seizing in the cold. Eryk found shelter in a shallow cave, barricading the entrance with rocks to keep out nocturnal predators. He fashioned a rudimentary fire using his suit's damaged power pack, the faint glow providing both warmth and a sense of fleeting comfort. As he sat there, his mind wandered to his crew. He could imagine them back at Camp Delta, mourning him, preparing their next moves without him. A wry smile tugged at his lips. He wasn't ready to be a memory just yet. Morning on Lyran 3 was as unforgiving as its nights. Eryk pushed onward, each step a battle against exhaustion and pain. The Serites were relentless hunters, and he could feel their presence, hear their clicking communication in the distance. They were tracking him, waiting for the moment he faltered. But Eryk had no intention of giving them the satisfaction. A particularly narrow canyon forced him to navigate a treacherous path along a crumbling ledge. One misstep sent a cascade of loose stones tumbling into the abyss below. He froze, clinging to the rock face as Scifistories skittered into view below him, their iridescent shells glinting in the weak sunlight. He held his breath, willing them to pass. They didn't. Instead, they began to climb. "Not today," Eryk muttered, pulling himself onto a more stable outcropping. He scrambled upward, kicking loose debris to slow the creature's ascent. Reaching the top of the canyon, he spotted a natural rock arch leading to the other side. He bolted across, timing his steps with the cracks forming beneath him. The Scifistories reached the arch moments later, but their combined weight proved too much. The structure collapsed, sending them plummeting into the chasm. Eryk didn't pause to celebrate. He pressed on, fueled by adrenaline and a growing sense of defiance. By the time he reached the outskirts of Camp Delta, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting the landscape in hues of orange and purple. Eryk stumbled into the open, his tattered form silhouetted against the glowing dome of the camp's shield. Inside, the perimeter alarms blared. Lila and Rafe rushed to the monitors, their jaws dropping in disbelief. "Impossible," Lila whispered. "It can't be." But it was. Eryk Halden, bloodied, battered, and unyielding, was walking straight toward them. The camp's gates opened, and the crew spilled out to meet him, their shouts of astonishment blending into a cacophony of relief and joy. Eryk managed to grin, his voice raspy but firm. "Miss me." And with that, he collapsed into their arms. Eryk awoke to the soft hum of a med bay's machinery, the antiseptic smell of disinfectant filling his nostrils. Pain throbbed in every fiber of his body, but it wasn't what fueled the fire simmering within him. His eyes snapped open, and when he saw Lila and Rafe standing nearby, the anger surged. "What the hell were you thinking?" he rasped, his voice raw but cutting. He struggled to sit up, waving off Rafe's attempts to push him back down. "You left me out there. You left me to die." Lila flinched but quickly masked it with a defensive glare. "We didn't have a choice. There was no sign of life, and the storm." "Don't," Eryk snapped, his voice rising. "Don't tell me about choices. I made mine out there, bought you the time to retreat. And you? You didn't even check. You just left." Rafe looked down, fidgeting with the corner of his tablet. "Captain, it wasn't like that. The Scifistories." "I know exactly what the Scifistories are like." Eryk cut him off. He gestured sharply toward the medbay door. "I stared them down, fought through their territory with nothing but rocks and sheer spite. You think I don't understand the risk? The risk is why I gave the order to run in the first place, but abandoning me." He shook his head, his voice tinged with bitter disbelief. "That wasn't a decision. That was a betrayal." For a moment, the room was silent, except for the rhythmic beeping of the monitors. Lila met his gaze, her jaw tight. "We thought you were dead, Eryk," she said finally, her voice quieter but no less firm. "The reading showed nothing. No pulse, no oxygen levels, nothing. You've been out there, you know how fast that storm kills. What were we supposed to do? Stay and die alongside you?" "Yes," Eryk said, his tone colder than the icy winds of Lioran 3. "Or at least confirm I was gone before running. But don't stand there and try to justify writing me off." The weight of his words hung heavily in the air. After a moment, Lila's shoulders sagged, the hardness in her expression softening. "You're right," she admitted. "We should have done more. And I should have fought harder for another sweep. But we didn't. I didn't. And now you're here, against every odd in the universe, calling me out for my failure. So what's next?" Eryk studied her, his anger ebbing slightly. Her words weren't an excuse, they were an acknowledgement, raw and unfiltered. He leaned back against the bed, his strength momentarily spent. "What's next," he said quietly, "is figuring out how we keep this from happening again. To anyone." By the next morning, the tension in Camp Delta had settled into an uneasy truce. Eryk's words still lingered in the air, but the crew threw themselves into their duties with renewed focus, as if action could scrub away the guilt. Eryk, stubborn as ever, was already up and moving. Ignoring the medbay staff's protests, he stalked into the command tent, leaning heavily on the table as a new wave of dizziness hit him. Captain Lila began cautiously. "Save it," he said curtly. "We've got bigger problems." The holographic map of the region flickered to life, displaying the network of Serite hives and the territory they controlled. Eryk tapped a section of the map near the cliffs where he'd first been ambushed. "The Serites are organized far more than we realized," he began. "They're not just random killers, they have rules, patterns. They retreat from certain areas, guard others like their lives depend on it. We need to understand why." "What are you suggesting?" asked Alan, the team xenobiologist, watching Eryk warily. "I'm suggesting we stop hiding behind shield domes and start gathering intel," Eryk said. "We observe their behavior, their territory, figure out what drives them, what scares them." "Scares them?" Rafe asked, skeptical. "You think Serites feel fear?" "I know they do," Eryk replied, his voice steady. "I've seen them abandon ground when something bigger came along. They're not the top of the food chain here, and if we want to survive, we need to learn what they're afraid of." 2 days later, Eryk stood at the edge of Serite territory, his anger from earlier replaced by a grim determination. Lila had reluctantly approved the mission, but her parting words still echoed in his mind, "Don't make me regret this." The team consisted of Alan, Rafe, and Kalor, the demolitions expert. Their goal was simple: observe the Serites from a safe distance and map their behavior. It was dangerous, but it was also necessary. As they moved cautiously through the jagged terrain, Eryk's eyes scanned every shadow, every movement. The familiarity of the environment stirred a mix of dread and resolve within him. "Up there," he said, pointing to a ridge overlooking a Serite hive. The group climbed in silence, setting up observation equipment behind a cluster of rocks. Below them, the hive pulsed with an eerie bioluminescence, Serites scuttling in synchronized patterns. Aylin adjusted a pair of binoculars, her fascination evident. "There. Efficient," she murmured. "Everything they do seems to have a purpose." "Yeah, well," Kalor muttered, keeping his rifle trained on the hive. "Their purpose involves turning us into snacks." Eryk ignored the exchange, his focus on the Serites. Hours passed as the team documented the creatures' movements, noting their meticulous organization. Then Eryk spotted something unusual. "Look there," he said, pointing to a group of Serites carrying chunks of metallic ore into the hive. "They're mining." "Mining?" Rafe asked, frowning. "What would they need metal for?" Aylin tilted her head, considering. "Maybe for armor? Or tools? Or bait?" Eryk said grimly, his expression darkening. As night fell, the Serites' behavior shifted dramatically. They became frantic, their movements erratic. A low hum emanated from the hive, sending vibrations through the ground. "What's happening?" Lila's voice crackled over the comms. "They're preparing for something," Eryk replied, "but not us." A deep roar echoed through the canyon, and the ground trembled. Moments later, a colossal shadow emerged from the storm. The creature was massive, with glowing eyes and serrated limbs that gleamed in the dim light. The Serites surged forward in a coordinated attack, their numbers overwhelming. But the behemoth was unstoppable, tearing through the hive with ruthless efficiency. "We need to leave," Rafe said, his voice tight. "Not yet," Eryk replied, his gaze locked on the battle. "This is what I needed to see." When the behemoth finally retreated, leaving destruction in its wake, Eryk turned to the team. "The Serites aren't the apex predators here," he said. "They're prey. And if they can survive this, then we need to find out how." Eryk and his team returned to Camp Delta under cover of night, their equipment laden with data and samples. The weight of their discoveries pressed on all of them, but Eryk was driven by a singular focus. He stormed into the command tent, his shoulders squared, the exhaustion in his step hidden behind a facade of purpose. "We need a plan," he said without preamble. Lila and the rest of the senior staff turned to him, the tension in the room thick as a Serite hive wall. "We don't even know what that thing was," Lila countered, leaning on the halotable. "Or why it attacked the Serites in the first place. We're stumbling in the dark," Eryk. Then we turn on the lights, Eryk replied, his tone sharp. The Scifistories have figured out how to coexist with those monsters, or at least survive them. We're not leaving this planet, so we better figure it out too. We might not have to, Rafe interjected hesitantly. Command is sending a shuttle for resupply in 3 days. We could just evac. Eryk's glare cut through the air like a blade. Evac? After everything we've been through? After what we've learned? No. This planet is a goldmine of resources, and more than that, it's a challenge. Running would make everything we've done worthless. You don't get it, Captain Rafe shot back, uncharacteristically defiant. You survived out there once. That doesn't make you invincible. We've lost good people already. What's stopping that from happening again? Eryk's jaw tightened. He took a step closer to the table, his hands gripping its edges. What's stopping it is us. We adapt, Rafe. That's what humans do. We make tools, we make plans, and we outlast whatever the universe throws at us. For a long moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the holomap. Then Aelin cleared her throat. The Scifistories' hive structure, she began, hesitant but steady, suggests a defensive network. Their use of metal could mean they're building fortifications or even weapons. If we study the hive remains, we might find answers, maybe even something we can use to bolster our defenses. Agreed, Eryk said, his focus shifting to Aelin. But we don't just study the hive. We also prepare for a worst-case scenario. Kalor, I want you working on countermeasures, explosives, traps, whatever we can deploy in a pinch. Kalar grinned, tapping the side of his holstered blaster. Finally, some orders I can get behind. And what about the shuttle, Lila asked, her voice steady but wary. Eryk's gaze softened just enough to show he understood her concerns. The shuttle stays on standby. If things go south, we'll use it. But not before we exhaust every option here. Agreed. There was no immediate answer, but one by one, the team nodded. The following day, Eryk led a team back to the destroyed hive. The carnage was even worse than they'd anticipated. Scifistory exoskeletons littered the ground, cracked and burned, their iridescent glow dimmed to a sickly gray. The hive itself was a ruin of twisted resin and collapsed spires. This is, grim, Aelin said, her voice tinged with unease as she knelt to examine one of the Scifistory remains. They never stood a chance. They fought like hell, though, Kalar noted, kicking aside a severed limb. Look at this, claw marks everywhere. Whatever that thing was, it didn't walk away unscathed. Which means it can bleed, Eryk said, crouching next to a deep gash in the rock. A faint metallic residue glinted in the sunlight, and if it can bleed, it can die. That's comforting, Rafe muttered, scanning the perimeter with his rifle at the ready. Except we'd need a hell of a lot more firepower than we've got. Not if we use their tools, Eryk replied, pointing to a section of the hive still partially intact. The Scifistories were using this for something. Aelin, see what you can find. As Aelin sifted through the debris, she uncovered what looked like a strange, crystalline apparatus embedded in the hive wall. Its surface was etched with patterns that pulsed faintly when touched. This isn't natural, she said, her brow furrowed in confusion. It's like they were trying to harness something. Energy, Kalar guessed. Maybe, Aelin replied. Or communication. It could explain how they coordinate so effectively over large distances. Eryk examined the device, his mind racing. If this is how they communicate, it could be how they summon reinforcements, or even call for help against those behemoths. That's a risky assumption, Rafe warned. Riskier than sitting back and hoping we don't get torn apart, Eryk shot back. Back at camp, the team worked tirelessly to integrate the Scifistory technology into their own systems. Aelin and Rafe spearheaded the effort, their expertise in xenobiology and engineering making them the best suited for the task. Days passed in a blur of calculations and tests. The crystalline apparatus was difficult to reverse engineer, its alien design defying conventional logic. But progress was made, and eventually they managed to establish a rudimentary connection. It's working, Aelin said, her voice tinged with awe as the device emitted a steady hum. It's broadcasting a signal. To who or what, Lila asked, her arms crossed. "We're about to find out," Eryk replied. Minutes passed with no response, and tension in the room grew palpable. Then a low, resonant clicking filled the air. "The Scifistories," Alan whispered. The clicking grew louder, more complex, until it became clear it wasn't random noise. It was language or something like it. "They're answering," Eryk said, his expression unreadable. "What are they saying?" Kalor asked. "We'll have to figure that out," Alan said, frantically recording the patterns. "But one thing's certain, they know we're here." The days that followed were a whirlwind of breakthroughs and challenges. The team deciphered fragments of the Scifistories communication, learning just enough to send rudimentary messages. Through trial and error, they managed to convey their intent, not hostility, but survival. To their astonishment, the Scifistories responded. Small groups approached the camp, keeping their distance but refraining from attack. It was a tenuous truce, built on mutual necessity. But Eryk knew it wouldn't last. The behemoths were still out there, and sooner or later they would come. "Any word from the shuttle?" Lila asked one evening as she joined Eryk on the camp's outer wall. "They'll be here tomorrow," he replied, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Good," she said, "because whatever happens next, we're going to need every resource we can get." Eryk nodded, the weight of their situation settling heavily on his shoulders. The Scifistories were no longer their enemy, but their survival and the survival of this fragile alliance was about to be tested in ways none of them could predict. The morning was heavy with anticipation. The shuttle arrived just as planned, descending from the clouds like a gleaming promise of salvation. Its engines roared, stirring dust and debris as it landed within the perimeter of Camp Delta. The crew watched as the ramp lowered, and a squad of reinforcements disembarked, their equipment gleaming and pristine. Supplies, weaponry, and fresh personnel had arrived to bolster their efforts. But the momentary relief was overshadowed by the distant, guttural roar that rippled through the air. Eryk turned to the horizon, his expression grim. "It's coming." The camp fell into a flurry of activity. Shields were reinforced, weapons distributed, and fallback points established. The Scifistories had become an unlikely ally, their small delegation no more than 10 lurking near the outskirts of the camp. Their chittering communication with Alan and the team had grown more urgent, though its meaning was still murky. Eryk stood at the command station with Lila, Kalor, and Rafe, going over the final defensive plans. The holographic map displayed the camp and the surrounding terrain, with markers for the anticipated approach of the behemoth. "It's bigger than the last one," Rafe said, studying the readings from the perimeter sensors. "The ground vibrations alone suggest a mass at least twice the size." "Twice the size, twice the problem," Kalor muttered, checking the explosives he'd set to detonate in key choke points. "Let's hope it's also twice as dumb," Eryk said. "We lure it into the ravine here," he pointed to a narrow canyon near the camp's eastern edge, where it'll have limited mobility. "Then we hit it with everything we've got." "And if that doesn't work?" Lila asked. Eryk's expression hardened. "Then we improvise." The first sign of the behemoth's approach was a low rumble that shook the camp's foundations. The Scifistories reacted instantly, their chittering rising to a frantic pitch. They scuttled toward the perimeter, their movements synchronized and purposeful. "They're preparing for a fight," Aylin observed, her voice tinged with both awe and concern. "Let them," Eryk said, stepping out onto the wall. "The more firepower on our side, the better." The ground trembled as the behemoth came into view. It was a nightmare given form, its serrated limbs slicing through the air, its glowing eyes blazing with an otherworldly fury. The creature let out a roar that reverberated through the canyon, shaking the very air. "Positions," Eryk barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. The crew took their places along the defensive line, weapons trained on the approaching monstrosity. The Scifistories, too, moved into formation, their alien cohesion an eerie counterpoint to the human soldiers' ordered ranks. The battle began with a cacophony of sound. Heavy weaponry fired in unison, streaks of plasma lighting up the sky as they struck the behemoth's armored hide. Explosions rocked the canyon as Kalor's traps detonated, sending shrapnel tearing into the creature's legs. But the behemoth was relentless. It barreled forward, swiping its massive claws through the defenses. One of the shield emitters buckled under the impact, and a section of the perimeter collapsed. The crew scrambled to regroup as the creature pressed its advantage. Amid the chaos, Eryk saw an opportunity. The Scifistories were focusing their attacks on the behemoth's joints, their precision strikes weakening the creature's mobility. Inspired, he activated his comms. Rafe, focus fire on the joints. Take out its legs. Got it, Rafe replied, directing the crew to target the creature's vulnerable points. The strategy worked. The behemoth staggered as its front left leg gave way, crashing into the ground with a deafening roar. But even immobilized, it was far from defeated. The creature reared back, its glowing eyes locking onto the camp as it let out a furious roar. It lunged with surprising speed, its massive form tearing through the defenses. Eryk barely had time to react as a claw sliced through the command station, sending him sprawling to the ground. He groaned, his vision swimming, but forced himself to his feet. Captain Lila shouted, rushing to his side. I'm fine, he grunted, grabbing his weapon. We're not done yet. The final blow came not from the humans, but from the Scifistories. As the behemoth turned its attention to the camp, the Scifistories executed a coordinated maneuver. A group of them climbed onto the creature's back, their claws tearing into its armored hide. Another group deployed what appeared to be crystalline devices, embedding them into the behemoth's joints. Eryk watched in awe as the devices began to glow, emitting a high-pitched frequency that seemed to disorient the creature. It thrashed wildly, its movements growing weaker with each passing second. This is it, Eryk shouted. Everyone, hit it with everything you've got. The combined assault of human weaponry and Scifistory tactics proved too much for the behemoth. With a final, ear-splitting roar, the creature collapsed, its massive body crashing to the ground. The impact sent a shock wave through the canyon, silencing the battlefield. For a moment, no one moved. Then a cheer rose from the crew. The Scifistories, too, let out a series of clicks and chirps that sounded almost triumphant. In the aftermath, the camp was a mix of celebration and somber reflection. The victory had come at a cost. Several crew members were injured, and the camp itself was heavily damaged. But they had survived. Eryk stood on the camp's outer wall, watching as the Scifistories returned to their territory. One of them paused, turning back to face him. Its iridescent eyes locked onto his, and for a brief moment, he felt a strange connection, a silent acknowledgement of their shared struggle. You think they'll stick around? Lila asked, joining him. Maybe, Eryk said. Or maybe they've just decided we're not worth fighting anymore. Lila smiled faintly. That's progress, I guess.